The Bible Treasury. A monthly magazine of papers on scriptural subjects. Volume 19, Article 1, Part 70 of 93, 1892 and 1893. The Early Chapters of Genesis. By William Kelly. Genesis 10 verses 13 and 14. Let us now look a little into the family of Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim begot the Ludim and the Anamim and the Lehabim and the Naphtuhim and the Pathruzim and the Casluhim, out of whom came the Philistines, and the Caphtorim, verses 13 and 14. So it is also in 1 Chronicles 1 verses 11 and 12. As there was a Shemite Lud, verse 22, it is important to distinguish from him, the ancestor of the well-known Lydian race in the west of Asia Minor, those descended from Mitzrayim, who spread themselves west of the Nile. They were archers, as we learn from Isaiah 66 verse 19, and Jeremiah 46 verse 9, where the African people seem enumerated and so described. It would appear to be the same in Ezekiel 27 verse 10, and in Ezekiel 30 verses 4 and 5 also. In the authorized version of Jeremiah 46 is given the word Lydians, as in Ezekiel 30 Lydia. This conveys the impression that our translators probably understood the Asiatic people. But there ought not to be a doubt that they were African. We next hear of the Anamim, of whom nothing more is said in the Bible than in the two genealogical lists. It may perhaps be gathered, from comparison with the names which follow, that they were a race that settled in the delta of Egypt. But it must be allowed that no reliable trace is known either in the ancient geographers or in the monuments hitherto deciphered. Here we have the unfailing record of God, who alone saw the end from the beginning and has been pleased to communicate to us the truth otherwise unnoticed. The judgment of the habitable earth in a day which approaches will prove that the races are not extinct. The Lehabim, called also Lubim in 2 Chronicles 12 verse 3, 2 Chronicles 16 verse 8, with the people called Phut, or Put, if not Pul, as in Isaiah 66 verse 19, answers to the ancient Libyans, save indeed that the ordinary usage of Libya in olden time is vague, and extends far and wide to almost all Africa west of the Nile. The Phut of Scripture apparently corresponds with the hieroglyphic Ba or Pet. This is also applied to a people, or rather a confederacy of peoples, conquered by Egypt, and called the Bows, or Nine Bows, Anapetu, though Brugge understands simply the nine peoples. This would seem to connect itself with the Naphtuhim immediately following the Lehabim, who are the same as the Lebu or Rebu of the Egyptian inscriptions, as Mr. R. S. Poole has shown, the Libyans proper. The authorized version renders Phut the Libyans in Jeremiah 49 verse 2, handling the shield, distinguished from the Lydians, or Ludim, handling and bending the bow, and in Ezekiel 38 verse 5 Libya, again marked with other powers by the shield. In Nahum 3 verse 9 we see Phut and the Lubim helpers of No-Amen, the god Amen of No, or Thebes of Upper Egypt, the ruins of which, in spite of Cush and Mitzrayim, is set by the prophet as a warning to Nineveh. Again, and bearing on what is still future, we are told that when the last king of the north subdues and spoils Egypt, the Lubim and Cush shall be at his steps, though Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon shall be delivered out of his hands. What plainer proof can there be to the believer that these races are yet abiding and to take their part in the great catastrophe of the latter day? The reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, directly or indirectly, did not extend beyond Daniel 11 verses 31 and 32. That which we have pointed out is after the great break of verse 35, and expressly supposes the renewal of the two powers of the north and the south, when the king, the lawless one, is in the land between them at the time of the end. Thus that time is as clearly future as sure. Compare Isaiah 11 verse 14, which not only confirms the fact of old cognate but hostile races on the borders of the land but declares their final subjection to Israel under Messiah in that day. Of the Naphtuhim a little has been already said when speaking of the Lubim. More is given in Scripture respecting the next name of Pathruzim. From Isaiah 11 verse 11 Pathros as distinguished from Egypt would seem to be the upper part of the land. Ezekiel 29 verse 14, 30 verses 13 to 18 are supposed to point at the Theba, the desolation which the prophet declared should overtake all the land. The chief difficulty is, that Jeremiah speaks of Pathros, 44 verse 1, in connection with cities in Lower Egypt, and in a yet more general way later on, verse 15. But there does not appear in the group anything so decided as to set aside or referring Pathros to the land farther south. There remain the Casluhim, out of whom or whence came the Philistines, and the Caphtorim. These races can hardly be doubted to have occupied the delta before the Philistine migration to the Shephelah. Some suggest here a transposition, as Deuteronomy 2 verse 23, Jeremiah 47 verse 4, Amos 9 verse 7, expressly connect the Philistine immigrants with the Caphtorim. Pusey, commenting on the last of these scriptures, inclines to the conclusion, that there were different immigrations of the same tribe into Palestine, as of Danes and Saxons into England, where they all merged into one common name. The first day have been from the Casluhim, the second in time but chief in importance from the Caphtorim, and a third of Kirthim, probably from Crete, in the era of the judges added but a little to their strength, 1 Samuel 30 verses 14 to 16. Of these last, Cherethites and Pelethites figure as lifeguards of King David, foreigners like the Gittites. It is plain and certain that the architecture, whether of temples or of palaces, the sculpture and painting, and the various other monuments of Egypt for living or dead bear, like its original language, the marks of extreme antiquity and of high civilization. Idolatry flaunts us everywhere, but as Heron remarks, African nations, 271, Oxford Talboys, 1832, the first idea which presents itself from a view of these monuments must be that Thebes the No, or Noamen, of Scripture was once the capital of a mighty empire, whose boundaries extended far beyond Egypt, which at some distant period comprised a great part of Africa and an equally large portion of Asia. Her kings are represented as victors and conquerors, and the scene of their glory is not confined to Egypt, but often carried to remote regions. Prisoners of distant nations bow the knee before the conquerors, and count themselves happy if they can obtain their pardon. This is further confirmed by the many examples which evince the refinement of domestic life, and the degree of luxury to which the people had arrived. The narrow valley of the Nile could not supply all the articles, such as costly garments, perfumes, etc., which we find here represented. An extensive commerce was requisite, not only to obtain all this, but also to produce that opulence, and that interchange of ideas, which constitute its foundation. Denon, Voix dans la basse et haute Egypte, 1802, the great French government work, Description de l'Egypte, 1811, 1815, Hamilton, Remarks etc. 1809, Beltzoni, Narrative etc. 1822, Minutoli, Travels, 1824, and both series of Sir G. Wilkinson's Ancient Egyptians are the chief modern authorities.